He once said that other boys went to see Babe Ruth, but Babe Ruth came to see him. That is not bravado. That is an accurate description of what Jackie Coogan was at the peak of his fame, the most recognizable child on the surface of the earth, a boy so famous that sitting presidents shook his hand, European royalty received him at court, the Pope gave him a Golden Cross, and Babe Ruth, the most celebrated American athlete of the 20th century, waited in line for the privilege of his company. He earned the equivalent of nearly $70 million in today's money before he was old enough to shave. And when he turned 21 and asked his mother where that money was, she looked him in the eye and said no promises were ever made to give Jackie anything. Then she called him a bad boy. Then she went back to the house he had paid for and the fur coats and the diamonds and the fleet of expensive cars that she and her new husband had purchased with the fortune that a child had earned under lights while she watched from the side of the set. What happened to Jackie Coogan is one of the great institutionalized robberies in American cultural history. What came out of it is a law that has protected every working child performer in the United States for 85 years. That it took one boy being stripped of everything to make the country understand that children had rights is the oldest American story there is. The system only changes when it cannot look away from the damage it has done. He was born John Leslie Coogan on October 26, 1914, in Los Angeles, California, into a family that had been performing for as long as any of them could remember. His father, John Henry Coogan Jr., was a dancer and comedian on the vaudeville circuit. His mother, Lillian Rita Dolliver, had herself been a child performer, billed in her early years as Baby Lillian, and knew the mechanics of the industry from the inside in ways that one would have thought might have made her more protective of her own child when he entered it. She was not. His parents plopped him in front of an audience when he was 16 months old. He appeared in a silent film called Skinner's Baby in 1917, uncredited when he was 2 years old. By 4, he was a fixture in the family's vaudeville act, doing comedy and dance for whatever crowd his parents were playing that week. During these years, he became famous for his shimmy, a popular dance that he performed with professional precision. He had no childhood in any recognizable sense because childhood was never presented to him as an option. The night that changed everything came when Jackie was 4 years old and Charlie Chaplin was sitting in the Orpheum Theater in Los Angeles watching the vaudeville bill with no particular agenda. Chaplin, already one of the most celebrated figures in the world, later described the moment in his autobiography. He had been watching a dancer, Jackie's father, and noted it was nothing extraordinary, just a competent turn, when the dancer brought his small son on stage at the end to take a bow. The boy took the bow and then, apparently deciding that was insufficient, broke into a completely different dance, entirely improvised, looked knowingly at the audience, waved to them, and ran off. The audience erupted. He was made to come back for an encore, did a different dance again, and the house went wild. Chaplin wrote that it could have been obnoxious in another child. In Jackie Coogan, it was charming, irresistible, and technically remarkable. A 4-year-old who could read an audience and give them something different on the repeat was not a fluke. That was talent. Chaplin cast him in a small role in A Day's Pleasure in 1919 as a test, partly to determine whether a child who could electrify a vaudeville house could translate to the different language of the camera. He translated without apparent difficulty. Chaplin then spent the better part of a year making The Kid, a film that combined the comedy his audiences expected with a depth of feeling he had not attempted before. The story, Chaplin's little tramp discovers an abandoned infant, raises him, and is eventually forced to give him up, was emotionally autobiographical in ways Chaplin rarely acknowledged publicly. His own first son, Norman Spencer Chaplin, had died 3 days after birth, and production on The Kid began 10 days after the funeral, which tells you something about the emotional undercurrent running beneath every frame of the film. Coogan, as the Kid, was asked to perform grief, joy, mischief, hunger, and fear with the consistency and reliability of a professional adult. He did. Women wept just to see him on screen. One reviewer wrote, "He was 6 years old." The Kid was released in February 1921 and became the second highest grossing film of the year, cementing both Chaplin's status as the greatest filmmaker alive and Jackie Coogan's status as the first true child superstar in the history of cinema. There had been child performers in films before, such as Baby Marie Osborne, but there had never been anything like this. He received fan mail from every country in the world. His image appeared on the cover of every major magazine in the Western Hemisphere. He was photographed with the King of England. He met the Prince of Wales. When his promotional tours took him through American cities, local officials declared official Jackie Coogan days in schools released their students early so that children could line the streets and watch him pass. In Brooklyn in 1924, 100,000 boys and girls crowded into a park just to be in the same open air as him. The commercial machinery that attached itself to his face was staggering in its scope and a direct ancestor of the modern celebrity merchandise empire. Jackie Coogan peanut butter, Jackie Coogan dolls, Jackie Coogan stationery, records, whistles, figurines, clothing, shoes, caps, and toothbrushes. His image was not just a face on a poster, it was a brand applied to consumer goods with the enthusiasm of a corporation that has discovered an infinitely renewable resource. He was 7 years old. The resource was him. Nobody asked him how he felt about any of it. Nobody was legally required to. The films continued through the early 1920s with undiminished commercial power. Oliver Twist in 1922, in which he played the orphan with the mournful eyes and the outstretched bowl, was a hit of the first order. Peck's Bad Boy, My Boy, Trouble, Daddy, Circus Days, he was making multiple films a year, and between them doing promotional tours in his own private railway car, being received by heads of state and religious leaders, and everyone in between. By 1923, he was not merely the most famous child in America, he was the most famous person in America, outranking at the box office Rudolph Valentino and Douglas Fairbanks. In 1923, his father signed a record-breaking contract with Metro Pictures for $1 million plus a $500,000 bonus. In 1929, MGM paid him $500,000 as part of a contract that also gave him 60% of his film's profits. His first MGM film, Tom Sawyer in 1930, was the biggest box office draw of that year. The humanitarian chapter of his child career is the most forgotten and arguably the most remarkable. In 1921, Jackie Coogan donated a bundle of used clothing to a Near East relief campaign supporting Armenian and Greek refugees displaced by war and genocide, and the organization recognized something in the gesture worth pursuing. They approached his father about enlisting Jackie as the face of a fundraising effort. His father said yes, and explained why in terms that were more thoughtful than what the industry typically offered. He wanted Jackie to see some of the hardships and suffering other children of his own age had to endure, to understand the duty that all human beings owed one another. In 1924, Jackie Coogan embarked on what was called the Children's Crusade, a cross-country railroad tour of the United States, followed by a journey through Europe, raising money and collecting clothing and food for war orphans in Armenia and Greece. He spoke to crowds. He led parades. The mayor of Boston gave him the key to the city. August 16th was declared Jackie Coogan Day in Brooklyn, and 40,000 people met him in Prospect Park. He traveled to London, Paris, Rome, and Athens. In Rome, Pope Pius XI received him and presented him with the Golden Cross of the Order of Jerusalem. In Athens, the Greek government gave him the Silver Cross of the Order of St. George. When the crusade concluded, he presented the largest orphanage in Athens with bills of lading showing that more than $1 million in food, clothing, and supplies, the equivalent of nearly $15 million today, was on its way to the Near East as a direct result of his efforts. He was 9 years old. He was also, at this point, the first celebrity humanitarian in American history, a forerunner of everything that Audrey Hepburn did with UNICEF, and everything that George Clooney has done with Sudan, and everything that any famous person has ever done by pointing their fame at human suffering and saying this matters. Jackie Coogan did it in 1924, and the history books barely mention it. The problem with being a child star, the structural, inbuilt, inescapable problem, is that children grow up. The particular magic that audiences came to see in Jackie Coogan was rooted in a specific version of childhood. The pudgy cheeks, the mournful eyes, the tousled hair, the quality of innocence that could be projected onto a screen and given back to the audience as a version of their own best instincts toward children. As he moved through his early teens and the features sharpened and the boy became an adolescent, the magic began to dissipate. Hollywood wits, with the cruelty that Hollywood wits specialize in, said that senility had hit him at 13. His film work continued through Tom Sawyer in 1930 and Huckleberry Finn in 1931 with moderate success, but the era of Jackie Coogan as a national phenomenon was essentially over before he was old enough to drive. His father, Jackie Coogan Sr., had managed the family's finances with relative care during the peak years, investing conservatively and maintaining what should have been a substantial fortune. The family had established Jackie Coogan Productions, a corporation through which the boys' earnings were managed and distributed, and by most accounts, the money was held more or less intact as Jackie moved through his mid-teens, understanding that when he turned 21, it would all be there waiting for him. This was not a promise made in writing, because no promise in writing was legally required. It was simply an expectation, the expectation that parents who had guided a child through the most extraordinary career in the history of the medium would not steal from him. It was, in retrospect, a catastrophically naive expectation to hold about the particular humans involved. In May 1935, when Jackie was 20 years old, he was sitting in the back seat of a car near Pine Valley in San Diego County, returning from a day of dove hunting in Mexico with his father, his best friend, and former co-star Junior Durkin, the family ranch foreman Charles Jones, and Robert Horner. Jackie's father was driving on a winding mountain highway when an oncoming vehicle forced the car off the road. It rolled down an embankment. Everyone in the car was killed except Jackie, who had been riding in the rumble seat and was thrown clear. He survived with broken ribs and severe bruising. He was the sole survivor. He was 20 years old and had lost his father, his closest friend, and 3 other people he loved in a single afternoon, and had survived by the accident of his seating position. His father had been dead for only a few months when his mother married Arthur Bernstein. Bernstein had been the Coogan family's financial advisor for years, the man with the inside knowledge, the access to the accounts, the familiarity with every line of the fortune and how it was structured. He married Lillian Coogan in late 1936, and by the time Jackie turned 21 in October 1935, the machinery of what had been done to his money was already in motion. When Jackie asked his mother to account for his earnings, the response was not an apology or an explanation or a ledger showing him where it had gone. The response was a refusal. She and Bernstein had spent the money. They had spent it on fur coats and diamonds and jewelry and expensive automobiles and a lifestyle that had been funded entirely by the boy they were now declining to acknowledge. When pressed on the legal question, Lillian Coogan said, "I believe that is the law." And she was right. Under California law at the time, the earnings of a minor legally belonged to the parents. Every dollar Jackie Coogan had earned under those lights, in those costumes, performing for those cameras from the time he was 6 years old, legally, not a cent of it was his. She had stolen from him in plain sight of a legal system that had specifically arranged things so that what she was doing was not theft. Jackie went to lawyers. He had no money for lawyers because all his money had been spent on his mother's fur coats. He asked Charlie Chaplin for help. Chaplin handed him $1,000 in cash without hesitating. He had not seen Jackie in years and did not wait to be asked twice. The $1,000 funded the beginning of the legal battle. Jackie filed suit in 1938 against his mother and stepfather, claiming the assets of Jackie Coogan Productions and demanding a full financial accounting. His mother and stepfather fought him. Lillian Coogan wept on the witness stand and called her son a bad boy. She said no promises had ever been made to give him anything. She said his acting had been just playing, as though the checks that had been deposited into her accounts were somehow the natural consequence of her own labor rather than the labor of a child performing in front of cameras he had not been asked if he wanted to stand in front of. The lawsuit ground through California courts for 18 months, generating depositions and affidavits and hearings that became increasingly painful as the full picture of what had been spent and on what emerged into public record. The studio system, suddenly aware that the optics were dangerous, hurried to assure journalists that no current child stars, not Shirley Temple, not Mickey Rooney, not Deanna Durbin, would suffer Coogan's fate. The assurances were hollow because the law that would have made them meaningful did not yet exist. When the case concluded, Jackie received $126,000 after legal fees, a fraction of the $250,000 that was all that remained of a fortune that had once approached $4 million, the equivalent of $70 million today. His mother kept the rest. The law said she was entitled to it. The law was wrong, and the public knew it, and the California legislature finally said so. In 1939, the California Child Actors Bill was signed into law. It became known almost immediately as the Coogan Act, and the name has stuck for 85 years. In its original form, the law required that a child actor's employer set aside 15% of the child's earnings in a protected trust, a Coogan account, that could not be touched by parents, managers, or anyone else until the child reached adulthood. It also established regulations governing the schooling, working hours, rest periods, and general welfare of minors employed in the entertainment industry. It was the first law of its kind anywhere in the world. It was passed because one boy had lost everything, and because the country had watched it happen and been unable to look away. The law's original form was weaker than what was needed. Parents retained control of the 85% of earnings not placed in trust, which still left enormous room for exploitation. It was strengthened significantly in 2000 and again in 2004 when California amended the Coogan Act to ensure that 100% of a child's earnings are considered their own property, even if only 15% must be deposited in the blocked account. The amendments came in response to continuing evidence that the original law's protections were insufficient, that parents and managers were still finding ways to drain the money that was supposed to be untouchable. Every generation apparently needed its own reminder that children in the entertainment industry required specific and robust legal protection because the industry's incentive to treat them as assets rather than human beings never went away. Jackie Coogan, meanwhile, was rebuilding his life with what the courts had left him, which was very little, and what the law could not restore, which was the decade of young adulthood he had spent watching other people spend his money while he waited for what he believed was rightfully his. He made a vaudeville tour in 1936 and 1937 to keep himself solvent. He married Betty Grable in 1937, which briefly made him the most discussed married man in Hollywood. Grable was already a significant star and getting significantly more famous, while he was a man who had been the biggest star in the world and was now working nightclubs for the cash to cover his legal bills. He was married to the woman the audience wanted while the audience wanted someone else. They divorced in 1940. Grable would go on to become the most popular pinup of the Second World War. Coogan would go on to the army. He enlisted in March 1941. Months before Pearl Harbor, and when the attack came, he requested a transfer to the Army Air Forces because he had been flying civilian aircraft and thought he could be more useful in the air. He trained as a glider pilot, which is a category of military service that requires a particular kind of nerve. Gliders carry no engine, make no sound, and once released from their tow planes are committed to landing wherever they happen to find themselves, in darkness or daylight, under fire or not. He volunteered for hazardous duty and was assigned to the 1st Air Commando Group, which operated in the China-Burma India Theater. In 1944, he flew British Chindit troops behind Japanese lines in the Burma campaign, a mission that required landing engineless aircraft on improvised jungle strips in the dark with enemy forces in the surrounding terrain. For his distinguished service, he was awarded the Air Medal. He flew those missions competently and came home a decorated veteran, which the industry that had consumed his childhood noted with polite indifference. The post-war career was the grinding, undignified middle section that the mythology of stardom never prepares anyone for. He was too young to be treated as a nostalgic curio and too associated with a specific moment in film history to be taken seriously as a contemporary actor. He worked in B pictures, mostly playing villains and heavies. He worked in television as it grew into the dominant medium, taking guest roles on whatever shows would have him. He developed a drinking problem and was arrested for drunk driving. There were reported issues with drugs. He appeared in nightclubs and on radio programs and in ice shows, and in anything else that would pay him enough to stay vertical and keep a roof over his head. He had been the most famous child in the world, and he was now a working character actor scrambling for day rates, and the distance between those two facts was not something he ever entirely metabolized. He said once, with the compressed bitterness of a man who has made a kind of peace with something he will never fully accept, "Hollywood is a lovely place to get knifed in." The second act that nobody predicted came in 1964 when a television producer named David Levy cast him as Uncle Fester in a new sitcom called The Addams Family. Fester was bald, pale, obese, given to inserting light bulbs into his mouth to make them glow, enthusiastic about explosives and medieval torture devices, and absolutely, unconditionally beloved by the audience that found the show. Coogan was 49 years old, nearly broke, and had spent 2 decades in the professional wilderness when the role arrived. He played it with the same instinct for what an audience wanted that had made a 4-year-old irresistible to Charlie Chaplin in 1919. The show ran for 2 seasons, 1964 to 1966, was cancelled before it fully exhausted its audience, and gave Coogan enough renewed visibility to keep working steadily for the remaining years of his life. He never lacked for work again, which was not the same as ever having enough money, but was considerably better than the preceding 20 years. In 1972, Charlie Chaplin returned to the United States for the first time in 20 years to receive a Lifetime Achievement Academy Award. He had been effectively exiled since 1952, when the U.S. government revoked his re-entry permit during the McCarthy era, and the return was a cultural event of considerable significance. When Chaplin's plane landed in Los Angeles, a group of people were there to greet him. He moved along the receiving line with polite handshakes, greeting strangers and former colleagues with the reserved civility of a man who has learned to hold the world at a slight distance. Then he reached Jackie Coogan, whom he had not seen in decades, and everything changed. He immediately recognized him, embraced him warmly, and said, "You know, I think I would rather see you than anybody else." Later, he took Coogan's wife aside and told her quietly, "You must never forget that your husband is a genius." It was the reunion of 2 men who had made something extraordinary together more than 50 years earlier, and who carried that fact between them like a shared secret the rest of the world had mostly forgotten. Coogan considered that reunion at the airport the proudest moment of his life. Not the fan mail from kings and presidents, not the children's crusade and the Pope's Golden Cross, not even the law that carries his name. The proudest moment was an old man recognizing him in a receiving line and saying he would rather see him than anyone else in the world. That tells you something about what celebrity takes from people. Not just money, not just time, but the ordinary human need to be valued for something other than what you can produce. He had produced extraordinary things. He had been producing since he was 16 months old. What he wanted in the end was for one person who had genuinely known him to be genuinely glad to see him. He got that finally at 57 in an airport in Los Angeles where the career had effectively begun. He died of heart failure on March 1st, 1984, in Santa Monica, California. He was 69 years old. He was survived by his 4th wife, Dorothea Lamphere, and 4 children. His grandson, Keith Coogan, would later have an acting career of his own, starring in films like Adventures in Babysitting, carrying the name into a 3rd generation. The law that bears Jackie's name lived on more robustly than he had, gathering strength through amendments and court decisions and the slow accumulation of cases in which children were protected who would not have been protected without it. Macaulay Culkin, who famously used the Coogan Act to protect his earnings from Home Alone, the child casts of every Disney Channel series, every working child actor in California whose parents cannot legally empty their accounts. The law is imperfect and has been gamed and has required strengthening and will probably require strengthening again, because the financial incentive to exploit children in show business is structural and permanent, and the law is always playing catch-up with human ingenuity in the service of greed. But the law exists. It exists because a boy from Los Angeles was the most famous child on the planet, and then became the most robbed young man in California, and because the country watched it happen and eventually could not stand itself. The Coogan Act is what happens when the system finally looks at what it has done and decides it cannot do it again. That it took Jackie Coogan losing everything to make that decision is the part of the story that should not be forgotten. Not because the law is not a genuine achievement, but because every genuine achievement of this kind has a cost, and the cost was paid by a child who never got to choose whether to pay it. I hope this helps tell the full story of Jackie Coogan and provide. Please don't forget to like this video, leave a comment below about which part of Jackie's life surprised you most, and subscribe to the YouTube channel for more stories from the legends of the screen. Bye.